All right, let's jump right in. We're going to be talking about one of the most just chaotic and transformative periods in all of modern history. This is a time when Russia was completely remade, turned upside down, going from this ancient empire ruled by a czar to a totalitarian state forged in revolution, civil war, and frankly, unimaginable terror. And that really brings us to the core question here, doesn't it? This is a story about big ideals and even bigger brutality. It's about power vacuums and the incredibly cunning people who rush in to fill them. So how on earth did the dream of a worker's paradise turn into a nightmare of purges and gulags?
The pace of change here was just breathtaking. Think about this for a second. Russia starts 1917 with the Tsar, right? An ancient system of autocracy. By the end of that exact same year, it's a radical communist state. And then, just a little over a decade later, you have Stalin's iron-fisted dictatorship and complete control. How does a country change that fast? Well, let's break it down.
So everything kicks off right here, in March of 1917. You've got years of simmering social unrest, plus the absolutely catastrophic strain of World War I, and the whole Romanov dynasty just crumbles. Tsar Nicholas II is forced to abdicate, and boom, just like that, 3 centuries of autocratic rule are gone.
But here's the thing. The Tsar falling didn't mean instant stability. Oh no, far from it. What it really created was this giant power vacuum. This temporary, provisional government tries to step in, but they're weak. They can't make a decision. And most importantly, they aren't giving the people what they're screaming for: peace, land, and bread. And that in action? Well, it created the perfect storm for someone far more radical.
And who steps right into that storm? Vladimir Lenin and his crew, the Bolsheviks. Now, Lenin, he was a hardcore revolutionary. He looked at all this chaos, and he didn't see a crisis. Nope. He saw the opportunity of a lifetime, the perfect moment to grab power for his party.
Okay, and this is super important because it shows a huge split in how you even do a revolution. On one side, you've got the Mensheviks. They wanted a slow, broad, more democratic kind of movement. But Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they had a totally different and, frankly, a much more ruthless idea. They believed in a small, tight-knit, disciplined party of professionals, a vanguard, who would seize power for the people and basically drag them into a revolution whether they were ready for it or not. And their entire ideology, really, was built around one powerful idea. They claimed to be the champions of the proletariat. That's the industrial working class. See, their goal was never reform. It was all-out war against the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. They wanted to tear it all down and set up what they called a dictatorship of the proletariat.
So in October, they make their move. And let's be clear, this wasn't some huge popular uprising. It was a fast, decisive, and really brilliantly organized coup. The Bolshevik Red Guard stormed the Winter Palace, they arrested the provisional government, and they seized total control of the capital. Just like that, Lenin was in charge.
But, taking power is one thing. Holding on to it, that's a whole other ballgame. The next few years were just this brutal, bloody struggle for survival. The Bolsheviks had to use every single tool they had to hold on to their new, very fragile state.
And their grip on power was tested right away. They were plunged into a horrific civil war, the Red Army against the anti-Bolshevik White Army. To keep the war effort going, they brought in something called war communism, which basically meant seizing grain from peasants and nationalizing absolutely everything. The problem? This brutal policy almost completely wrecked the economy. So Lenin, who was always a pragmatist, takes a step back. He introduces the new economic policy, the NEP, which was kind of a temporary, tactical retreat to limited capitalism, really just to stop the country from starving to death.
Now, as Lenin's health starts to fail in the early 1920s, a totally new kind of battle begins. This one isn't fought on a battlefield, it's fought in the shadowy halls of the Kremlin. It's a power struggle for who's going to be the next leader. And it all boils down to 2 very different men: the brilliant, charismatic intellectual Leon Trotsky and the quiet, calculating bureaucrat Joseph Stalin.
Even Lenin himself, practically from his deathbed, saw the danger coming. In his last will and testament, he wrote this really chilling warning about Stalin. He said, Stalin had concentrated way too much power in his hands and was just too ruthless. Lenin actually urged the party to get rid of Stalin as general secretary. It was an incredible prophetic warning, and they completely ignored it.
And these two guys offered completely different paths forward. You had Trotsky, the true believer, pushing for a permanent revolution. He thought the only way Soviet Russia could survive was to spread the communist revolution all over the world, right now. But Stalin? He had a much more nationalist, maybe more pragmatic vision. Socialism in one country. His argument was pretty simple, really. He said, hey, let's forget about the rest of the world for a minute and focus on building an unstoppable industrial communist state right here at home first. So how did the quiet guy, the bureaucrat, win this fight? Well, because he was an absolute master of the political game. As general secretary, he controlled who got what job in the party, so he filled the entire system with people loyal to him. He was brilliant at making alliances to isolate Trotsky. And then, once Trotsky was out of the way, he'd turn on those very same allies. He just systematically dismantled his opposition until finally, Trotsky was kicked out of the party, exiled from the country, and, well, eventually assassinated. So by 1929, with all of his rivals gone, Joseph Stalin is the undisputed master of the Soviet Union. And this is where things get truly dark. He was about to reshape the entire country with a kind of brutality that, honestly, even the old czars could never have dreamed of. His first huge move was something called collectivization. The logic was this: to fund a massive industrial boom, he needed to control all of the agriculture. And that meant wiping out private farms. He forced tens of millions of peasants off their own land and onto these gigantic state-controlled collective farms. It was, in effect, a declaration of war on his own countryside. And to crush any resistance to this, Stalin did what all tyrants do. He created an enemy. He pointed his finger at the kulaks, basically slightly wealthier peasants, and labeled them a class of capitalist enemies who were holding back progress. They were systematically stripped of everything they owned, exiled to Siberia, or just outright executed. This whole policy, this dekulakization, along with seizing all their grain, led directly to a horrific famine that killed millions of people. And the terror wasn't random. It was a system. Stalin built an entire architecture of control. If you were a political prisoner, you were sent to the Gulag, this vast, brutal empire of slave labor camps. His own old comrades from the revolution? They were dragged into public show trials, forced to confess to absurd, impossible crimes, and then executed. And it all reached its peak with the Great Purge, this tidal wave of paranoia and terror that swept up millions, from the highest officials in the party all the way down to regular, everyday people.
So what was the point of all this suffering? It was for the 5-year plans. This was Stalin's great crusade to drag the Soviet Union, kicking and screaming, from a nation of farmers into an industrial superpower. And he didn't care what it cost. And yeah, he did achieve rapid industrialization, but that progress was literally built on the bones of millions of his own people. The human cost, it's just staggering to even think about.
So that brings us full circle. In just a couple of decades, Russia goes from Tsarism to Stalinism. And the Soviet Union that Stalin built, this industrial powerhouse, it would go on to defeat Nazism and become a global superpower. But it was a state founded entirely on terror, on paranoia, and on the graves of millions. And so that leaves us with this one final, really heavy question to think about. What is the real, lasting legacy of a state that's built on a foundation of terror?